Welcome to Auto Care on Air, a candid podcast for a curious industry. I'm Stacey Miller, Vice President of Communications at the Auto Care Association, and this is Traction Control, where we chat about recent news from the global to the local level and what it may mean to the industry, featuring guests on the front lines. Let's roll. All right, we're talking about a pretty serious issue today, a really timely issue that's happening with our friends up north in Canada. So I wanted to call my friend Adam Malik. Adam is from Turnkey Media, which manages automotive magazines such as Jobber News, Cars, and EV World. And quite frankly, anytime I have an issue that's going on in Canada, I turn to Adam because he's one of the greats reporting what's going on up north and making sure that we're all on the same page, talking about the effects on the automotive aftermarket. So welcome, Adam.
Thank you, Stacey. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So, Adam, tell me what's going on with the Canadian Railways. Something pretty serious happened at midnight.
Yeah, midnight this morning, Canadian Railways, both main railways went on strike, basically shutting down movement of goods across the country, and not just across the country, but into the U.S. as well, going back and forth. They've shut down. We've been hearing about this for several weeks, if not maybe months, that this could be happening. I think most people hope that, like most serious negotiations, it would reach a last minute decision, but it didn't happen. Everything from consumer goods, commercial goods, commuter trains, even in Toronto,
Wow.
all ground to a halt.
That is absolutely insane to think about. I was doing some research and it said, like you said, everything from agriculture, there's auto parts on those trains, which is something that we need to talk about here today, but even the commuters. So this is going to affect people going to work this morning, right?
Yep. Yes. On the news this morning, people are just going, I can't go in, or they're finding alternative methods. What the methods are, I don't know. Either, grabbing an Uber for their normal, hour-long commute. I don't know. But yeah, people aren't going to work. Things aren't moving. And yeah, it's just really shutting down a lot of the way we're used to doing business around here.
So the labor dispute, from what I read, it shut down two major freight railroads. Do we know how many people that affects, the people who actually work there?
I don't know off the top of my head how many people it affects, but these are two significant rail lines in Canada. They crisscross the country, and like I said, they go into the U.S. from the U.S. back into Canada. These are the major lines for goods movement in Canada.
Yeah, and this is something that I didn't really think about until the news broke is, how many goods travel across the borders that are kind of vital to the U.S. economy. So this is a pretty big deal for a lot of businesses, but we're going to look at it from the lens of automotive.
Mm-hmm.
So has this, I'm just very new to the topic. Has this happened before with the railways in Canada? Do you know?
In terms of a strike, no, not that I can see. There was one guy from C.H. Robinson, which is a 3PL company. He was saying they've been in Canada for 100 years, never had a railway disruption, at least in terms of a strike anyway, no labor disruption to railways. So this is really unprecedented for us.
Wow, really new, really fresh. They're saying billions of dollars in, all the goods, period, are on these trains. It's confirmed that auto parts are on these trains, but tell me a little bit about your take on what you think the effects could be on the automotive aftermarket.
It's pretty widespread. I think if that's in the aftermarket, if you start looking first at the automotive industry as a whole, from the OE side, we got parts coming in from Europe. They'll hit Montreal, the port of Montreal, and they'll be shipped to Detroit, for example, to build vehicles, or these railways will be used to ship cars from one side of the continent to the other as we build. So it's a huge effect here, because if the OEs can't get parts to build cars, and then they can't get the cars maybe they already have shipped out, well, now we're kind of back in that problem of where new vehicle inventories are now suddenly going down because dealers can't get their cars can't be built. And we're going to see that effect that we kind of saw during the pandemic, where lack of inventory, all of a sudden now people look to the used market, used prices go up, people hang on to their cars longer, that sort of thing. And on first glance, I think, hey, that sounds good for the industry because, if it's more expensive to buy a new car or just aren't new cars available, or even if it's too expensive to buy a used car, then people are going to say, hey, well, then I'm just going to replace my car. I'm going to go to my shop down the street and I'm going to get it repaired there. Great, good stuff for the aftermarket, right? Well, yes, on first glance, I suppose, but on those railways are auto parts as well, like aftermarket auto parts as well. And this is the whole part of the USMCA, the new NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement. Parts go back and forth between our countries very often. I can't remember the exact, but I think it's at least that some parts are a dozen times they'll go back and forth. And if there's no way to send them by rail, well, now you're sending them by trucks, and trucks simply can't carry the load that railways do, right? Just the volume, and it's summer now, but if this were to carry on in the winter, or if this happened in the winter, weather becomes a factor in moving freight around by trucks. So you really want to have a solid rail system. So, I can see that driving up aftermarket prices. Maybe we can't even get the parts now. Kind of that problem we had in the pandemic, where just supply constraints just really, really hurt the aftermarket. Could we see that again? It depends how long on this goes. But that just high level perspective, I suppose, is just the impact it could have on our industry.
Yeah, and my mind went exactly. We had the same thought train that it's like COVID, or when the ship couldn't make it through the canal, right? We're seeing major delays in the supply chain, and day after day after day means another day of impact. So,
Absolutely.
I think about how did our industry respond during that time, and we saw companies, opening up new warehouses, diversifying where their supply was across the US from east to west in order to make sure that they had distribution networks. So, if they're affected on one side of the US, they can be able to distribute from the other side. Canada is obviously massive. Are you seeing the same with aftermarket companies looking to diversify their distribution strategies rather, as a result of what they learned from COVID and these other major unprecedented supply chain impacts that we've had the past couple of years?
Yeah, Canada's very much unique in that way from the U.S., where we are a large landmass that is sparsely populated, right? Americans outnumber us 10 to 1, basically, right? So we are spread over a large area, and we're really most of our population is concentrated, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, that sort of thing. But there's a lot in the rural areas, so getting parts out to them is a totally different ballgame. But you're seeing, I don't necessarily, I'm not necessarily going to say that the distributors here have put a thought into putting more warehouses everywhere, but there is at least one distributor, Vast Auto, for example, just opened a new satellite warehouse west of Toronto. Was that just to in anticipation of this, or just to serve the greater market? I'm not quite sure, but I think it's more to serve the greater market. But having an extra warehouse, I'm sure, doesn't hurt. But when I talk to jobbers, to the parts sellers, they are always looking to expand their footprint, their physical footprint, their store, because there's just so many auto parts out there right now. They need more and more space. And something that came out of COVID was there was a lot of talk, the just-in-time shipping method, the lean shipping. Toyota was famous for that. And that's where you order something and it just comes. You order it and it comes. And there's a lot of movement now, I think, to move away from that, to say, hey, you know what? Labor disruption, supply chain disruptions, we don't want that again. So we're going to fill up our warehouses. We're going to expand our warehouses. We're going to have more parts in our warehouses, so that when there is another pandemic, well, not in this case, and now it's a rail strike that could impact the parts you can get. Now I think there's much greater attention being paid to distributors, suppliers, just making sure that they have more in stock, as opposed to just that lean manufacturing. And even you want to talk about nearshoring. Nearshoring's been a big topic recent years. Moving more production to Mexico, for example. Well, how's that stuff being moved? Again, rail is what you generally would want, because it moves faster. Yes, some stuff moves by truck, but this idea of an idea, it's happened now, the strike. How does that impact nearshoring now? Because if you're depending on these systems to move your stuff around, and now all of a sudden there's labor disruption, is it still reliable? It's just, kind of feels like one blow after another for the auto sector. It's just the hits keep coming, and it's just another thing that this industry has to react to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, talk about nearshoring and having things in Mexico. I was reading related to the labor dispute that CDK, I guess, has trains in Mexico, but they're allowed to run in Mexico, but they can't, cross any borders or anything like that. So
Hmm.
doesn't really help us get it doesn't really help us get more parts, unfortunately. So
Unfortunately, no.
really, really big deal. One of the other things that I heard coming out of the pandemic and coming out of some of the other supply chain disruptions, gosh, we had so many thinking back upon it. Yet we were still such a resilient industry, as we heard, part suppliers and warehouse distributors talking about having more inventory, like more inventory than they need,
Hmm.
in order to be able to surmount something like this. Should it happen again? And here it is happening again. Are you hearing things like that on the ground in Canada?
Well, I don't think it's even just the cat. I think it's the industry as a whole, right? I think they're
Hmm.
saying we need to have more parts in stock. Parts proliferation alone is an issue. I remember actually, I think it was John Washwitz from the Alliance, and he was talking. I believe it was a Yang seminar where he said, this is more of at the peak of the pandemic, or maybe he was talking about the peak of the pandemic anyway. But we were just selling out of everything. It didn't even matter good, better, best. It's just, what do you got? Do you got this brake part? Do you have this muffler? Do,
Wow.
do you have? Just give it to us. We need to serve these customers, and we may end up seeing that if parts supply chains disrupted. These retail outlets just maybe going, yeah, here's what we got. This is all I got left here. Just have your pick. Which of these do you want? Like, do you want your preferred brand? Well, sorry, that's not really going to happen here.
Yeah.
We got, you don't want brand A, we got brand B. Here you go. That's all we got. That's what you got to deal with. And it's chaos. It can be chaos, I suppose, when you don't know what you're going to get, if you're going to get the reliable part that you're always used to.
Hmm.
But to what you said, this industry is resilient, found a way to get through it. We got through it, and probably came out better for it at the end. Now, has enough time passed to really build up that resiliency to be prepared for the next disruption? I don't know. We'll find out. But keep hearing it. This is a resilient industry. You always be able to bounce back, and I'd expect the same to happen here.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I get a little freaked out. Maybe you do too, when I hear about parts not being available and the prices going up, and that gets passed down to the drivers. It gets passed down to me, to you, to our friends, to our family, to our colleagues. And there's this stat that we publish. We've published every couple of years in the fact book. It comes from IMR, which is now Endeavor. It's the delayed maintenance number.
Hmm.
So there's
Hmm.
something like $30 billion in delayed maintenance, and
Yep.
some of that can be due to cost. So if cost is rising and drivers aren't maintaining their cars because it's too expensive at the time, and they're making decisions in this economy that's rife with inflation, hey, I'm going to buy groceries, I'm not going to change the brakes on my car. Like, that's a scary thought, knowing that there's
Hmm.
unsafe cars on the road because they can't afford those parts. So it's a big deal, and this industry really needs to respond to make sure that we have some sort of parts to provide to the drivers in the end, and that we can offer them at a price that's still going to allow them to be on the road safer longer.
Absolutely. And I don't want to misattribute to who said this. I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure it was said at Apex last year, where people, it's everything is going up in terms of cost. And when it's got my car fixed or buy groceries, groceries come out on top, and it changed a bit of the customer too. The people who could afford it were there's a certain segment of the population that can afford to get their car fixed, and so they didn't really have those concerns. And it was changing the shape of the customer that shops and outlets were seeing, because you're so used to seeing maybe the lower income guys, because they need their car, they have to get to work, it's their livelihood,
Yeah.
versus maybe more the white collar people who maybe work from home or now more remote, less so, but they are the ones who have the money to spend in the aftermarket, versus the lower income folks who are saying, listen, let's get my car fixed or buy dinner tonight, what's it going to be,
Right.
and it's really changed how this industry, the customers we're seeing, and how we basically think.
It really has. And it's something, unfortunately, we have to anticipate this now, for the
Mhm.
rest of our lives, right? Anything could happen. Anything can happen at any time. And we're not going to get much warning. I think the pandemic really changed that, and it
Yeah.
changed the way that companies think about their strategies and their parts proliferation, as you were saying. So astounding, really astounding to hear this news overnight.
Yeah, and these black swan events, right?
Hmm.
That they were calling them. Pandemic is one. Now, is this labor disruption going to be one? How long will this last? If I were to guess, it's not going to last too long. I imagine that the disruption to commerce will be too much for the government to ignore. I think eventually they will step in. Eventually, I mean, really soon, they will step in and say, you know what, back to work legislation or binding arbitration, something like that. Because for our industry, speaking specifically for our industry, you're going to see they're warning of auto plants just shutting down because they can't get the parts. So people
Right.
aren't going to be working. People are going to be out of work. I think the pressure will really be on to get a quick resolution to this. I can't see it dragging on. I mean, who knows? But I think this would be resolved. I hope it get resolved fairly quickly.
That is all of our hope. And I neglected to mention I wanted to have you share some of kind of like the top line industries for the automotive aftermarket in Canada for those who aren't really well versed on how many parts and how many people actually make up our
Oh,
industry in Canada.
oh, so we're about a 37.8, if I remember correctly, about $38 billion industry in Canada, affecting hundreds of thousands directly and indirectly of jobs across Canada. We have we're a vast country. We're a very unique country in the sense, we have you got the French-speaking population in Quebec. You got way out in BC, and then you got the prairies in the middle there, which are, everybody's got their own dynamic here, but it's very widespread. Very, I like to, it's a like I said, a vast area, but we're very small and very connected here. So yeah, a lot of people put to work thanks to the automotive aftermarket in Canada. That's for sure, including me.
A really amazing industry and a massive part of our ecosystem here in North America. So, Adam, is there anything else or any other thoughts on this event that we want to share with our listeners?
No, I think I think people's jobs here are at risk. I mean, no, sorry, I shouldn't put it that. But when you talk about plants shutting down for auto production and because they can't get the parts, I think that's a very real risk to our broader sector. And then the cost of parts, if we can't get it, as they'll go up because we just can't get the parts. Keeping that supply chain moving, I think it could have a huge effect, like pandemic-like effect, that we saw. So hopefully this gets resolved in short order, and we can go back to the way things were. And but I think that resilience part is really hits home for this issue. We got to be resilient. We are resilient, and just make sure that we can always respond to such issues.
All right. And I hear that there's maybe another implication related to this
Yeah.
labor dispute in Canada. What is that?
Well, less than Canada, more U.S. Now there's talk of U.S. port strikes
Oh,
happening on October 1st. I think there are 85,000 members, something like that, are now in a position where they could walk off the job. So we could be looking at, if this rail strike drags on, which I don't think it will. Hopefully it doesn't. We could have a rail strike and a port strike, and how will that affect? Because in anticipation of these rail strikes, a lot of shippers were diverting their ports. So instead of coming into Montreal, instead of coming to BC, they were going around to other ports. Well, if these ports now go on strike and this rail situation hasn't been settled, chaos is the word that comes to mind. Anarchy, maybe, I don't know,
yeah.
but it could really set things, pun intended, I suppose, off the rails.
Oh my gosh, no way. I mean, we've dealt with the Port of Los Angeles. Obviously, the Baltimore bridge collapse was a really big deal
Yeah.
for automotive. We're actually going to be at the Port of Baltimore in a week at our fall leadership days to see the impacts and see how they've been recovering. So that's a pretty big deal. So we're
Oh,
hoping
for
that a
sure.
resolution comes through here, very, very soon.
One punch after the other, it feels like.
Adam, where can people find you if they want to keep in touch with you or read some of the stories that you're publishing as you're doing some of the most relevant content that I've seen coming out of Canada?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. So online, we're at autoserviceworld.com. That is the online portal for, like you mentioned, our magazines and daily news, always keeping people updated as best we can. We got multiple newsletters going out throughout the week, for a week. And then as I'm on LinkedIn, you can find me there. Search my name. I'm sure you'll find me. Happy to connect. And I always would like to share our top stories, our top reads, just what's happening in the industry. I'm all about making this industry better and making a better place for all of us, and make it successful, because I want it to be successful. So
Amazing.
that's autoserviceworld.com, our website, and find me on LinkedIn.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam.
Oh, Stacey, it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Auto Care on Air is a production of the Auto Care Association, dedicated to advancing the auto care industry and supporting professionals like you. To learn more about the association and its initiatives, visit autocare.org.